So what we looked at in employment law so far is we have looked at this issue of what is an employee, okay, and the concept of employment. We've looked at the various obligations in terms of what the employer is responsible for doing, in terms of payment, in terms of notice, in terms of if they lay someone off, just cause, wrongful dismissal, constructive dismissal. We've talked about all of those things. We've also talked about wrongful hiring. You know, they shouldn't be hiring people who are not qualified for the job. The second part of what we looked at here last week was employment legislation. We largely talked about the Employment Standards Act in Newfoundland. And I did mention that the Employment Standards Act it is, labor is provincial jurisdiction. So as a result, there's a federal employment standard, and each of the provinces have their employment standards. The core employment standards across Canada are the same. However, there are differences in each province in subtleties of how the law is applied to dates and things. Right here, we went through the Newfoundland Labrador legislation. This guide right here, which I have linked, if you go into the slides, you can actually click on it, and it'll link to this. The provincial guide is designed for employers and employees, and it outlines the key items that are dictated in the employment standards. So effectively, what employment standards do is they create a minimum floor for all employment contracts between an employer and employee that says these things are law, regardless if they're written into the contract or not. These things are law and will supersede any contract. So days like public holidays, vacation pay, vacation time, sick leave, pregnancy leave, parental leave, adoption leave, bereavement leave, compassionate care leave, critical illness leave, crime-related child death or disappearance leave, reservist leave, family violence leave, communicable disease leave, notices of termination. All of those things are laid out in statute, meaning that a contract cannot contract under them. So you can't make them less in a contract. A contract can make them more, can go beyond the minimums, but it can't go less. So that was what we covered last week. Were there any questions on what we covered last week? Any burning issues? Okay, well, today, or the beginning of this week, the last section in this deals with part of the employment relationship that happens when we move into a unionized environment. So far, we have talked about the employment relationship between two entities, the employer and an individual employee, okay? And for the most part, that is the way that employment contracts are set up between a party and another party. And that other party tends to be one person. Now, what happens in a union relationship is the employment contract is between the employer and a group of people. Okay, so it's a blanket contract that covers a whole defined group of people. Hence, we've got this concept of a union. And what we have are some basic legislation in Canada. And I just wanted to go through some of the basic legislation and talk about what happens, first of all, in order to get that union formed up and to bring it into place in terms of law, and then how it works when it's up and running. So the legal environment that we live in says that every person, regardless of where they live in Canada, have the legal right to join a union and take an active role in helping to establish union where you work. And when I use the word every person, what I'm really saying, or what I should say, every employee has the right to join a union. So right off the bat, that is ingrained, so anyone can join a union. However, now I got to be careful when we use the word employee, because management and the owners are not considered employees. Okay, so you have to be someone who's not in control of the workplace in order to join the union for that workplace. Like everywhere else in Canada, and like everything else with the labor environment, jurisdiction matters, because where you live is going to have an impact on what piece of legislation is going to cover you. So the specific legal process that your union has to follow to be legally recognized depends on where the workplace is located. So labor law, for the most part, are covered by provincial pieces of legislation. And that works for about 90% of employees. 90 to 95% of employees in Canada are provincially regulated, whereas the other 10% are federally regulated. So you got this federal entity. If you're a federal employee or you're covered under federal legislation, that's laid out in the Constitution, what's covered there as federal. And provincial would be the other. But the thing is with provincial is that we have territories and provinces, and depending on which province you're in, that's the legislation that's going to constrain you. Defining what federal jurisdiction is really is laid out in the Constitution. And as you can see, this includes workplaces in the Yukon, Northwest Territories, Nunavut, and in the following industries are all covered under federal. The territories are not considered provinces in the strict sense, so they're all federal legislation. So if you're in the broadcasting industry, telecommunications industry, banking industry, or transportation, shipping, navigation, interprovincial or international transportation of goods or passengers, uranium mining, go figure, but this is coming out of World War II when uranium was used to make the nuclear bomb, grain handling and federal crown corporations, and obviously direct federal employees are covered under federal jurisdiction. So, okay, so everyone else is provincial. So that's the easiest way to look at it, is just define who the federal are, and if you're not under that category, you're provincial. So the very first thing that we're looking at in terms of the way the law is set up is the labor law in Canada says that unions can be set up. No question about it. Everyone has the right to join a union. The labor law also says this is how a union is to be set up. So again, I'm majorly focusing on Newfoundland here. The others mirror this almost identically, but each province is a little bit different in terms of the dates and the things like that. So in order to start a union and abide by the law, what you have to do is usually there's some form of, well, dissatisfaction, for lack of a better word, at work. And if you're not in a union, and if there is no union at work, if there's enough dissatisfaction, what you can do is you can say, you know, I think I'm going to form a union here. And how can you form a union? Well, you can get on the phone and you can phone or email a national union. Now, a national union really is, or a provincial union, it is an entity that is set up like the Newfoundland Association of Public Employees, NAPE, or the Unifor, which is it used to be the Canadian Auto Workers. Now it's private employees. It's the largest private employers union in Canada. So you can call up a union and say, you know, I think that the people in my workplace are right for a union, and I kind of think that you guys would be the best guys to represent us. So that's option one. And that's probably what happens most. The other times is when the union comes knocking on the door of you. So one way or the other, you know, it's either you contact them or they contact you. All of this has to be done in secret. And the reason it has to be done in secret is because the employer can effectively fire you, especially if you're on probation or some reason, you know, that we could call just cause, that we've talked about in an earlier section. You're putting yourself out there for the employer to say that you fundamentally breached the employment contract by going off to a union. So you need to be very, very careful at this stage. So initially, employees express their support for a union by signing union membership cards. So what happens is some instigator contacts the union, let's say. The union will supply something called membership cards. These are physical sheets of paper. They used to be. I imagine they could be done electronically as well as anything else now. But effectively, What it is a little sheet of paper that says, you know, given the opportunity, I would join your union. And you have to pay a small fee. And the reason that there's a small fee is to build some sort of consideration. Okay? So if we can get the majority of the workers to sign that card, then those cards can be sent to the Labor Relations Board of the jurisdiction. So let's assume that we're all ready to join a union and there are 10 people working in our workplace, okay? 10 people. We've got union cards gone out to all of them. 5 of them have expressed an interest in joining the union. So we end up, let's say, getting 5 union cards signed. We send it off to the Labor Relations Board, and the Labor Relations Board will go and look at it, and they'll say, well, there's 10 people working in the workplace. 5 have signed the union cards. Okay? Now, is that a majority? No, it's close to it. So what the Labor Relations Board can do then, and at that point, at the magic point that the Labor Relations Board gets involved, the union does not have to be a secret anymore. Because once the Labor Relations Board has been informed that there's union processing, the union process has started in the workplace, the employer cannot fire anyone for union activities. So it puts the clamps on the employer in terms of what the employer can do. So it constrains the employer in their ability to lay people off or do something to people who are union instigators. In the case of a situation, let's take a different situation where 10 of the 10 members sign the union card, okay? 10 of the 10 members sign. Labor Relations Board looks at it. They say, well, there's 10 people eligible to join the union or who are 10 employees. 10 of them sign. The Labor Relations Board will look at that and say, that's a vast majority. In fact, it's 100%. And the Labor Relations Board will say, yes, you union are now given the right to officially represent those workers. Now, in the case of the original situation, I gave you that 5 of the 10 workers signed the union card. That's enough for the Labor Relations Board to say, let's call a vote. So the Labor Relations Board calls up the employer and says, hey, I want to tell you that there has been a request to set up a union in your workplace. Once the employer picks themselves up off the floor, the employer says, okay, I don't like that idea. Well, too bad. What we're going to do is we're going to call a vote in your place of work, and we're going to ask the workers if they want to join the union or not. So in the instance where 10 of the 10 sign the card, it's automatic. The union is set up. There's no need of a vote. In the case where we're not sure if we got a full majority, Labor Relations Board will call a vote, and if 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 people agree, the union is set up. If 4 agree, the union is denied. Okay? But once the Labor Relations Board becomes involved, there's no repercussions to workers, no legal repercussions to workers. So as I say here, the board, the Labor Board will keep the membership cards confidential. They won't tell the employer who signed the card and who didn't. And so effectively, the membership card is really going to be so important to determine whether a union is formed or not. So the Labor Board then will look at it. They'll either have the election or to give approval. In Newfoundland and Labrador, more than 65% of the employees have signed the cards. The Labor Relations Board will automatically certify a union without holding a vote. If when at least 40% but less than 65% of the employees sign the union card, the Labor Relations Board will hold a certification vote, generally within 5 days. The Labor Board, though, is going to define what we call the bargaining unit. What we mean by bargaining unit is here are the group of employees that have a common interest, the bargaining unit. They may not be in the same building, but they have a common interest, single employer, or work at one entity. So supervisors are excluded from the bargaining unit because they're considered management. As I said to you, managers are not part of the union. So an appropriate bargaining unit is really determined by the common interest, wages, hours, working conditions, traditional industry groupings, physical location, amount of interaction, the supervision, who's supervising. It can get a little gray, but generally the Labor Relations Board defines that. Don't get too caught up in that. Then the Labor Relations Board, once it passes either that, if they do that vote, or if they automatically, more than 65% sign up, the Labor Relations Board certifies the union. So here's what happens to you as an individual once the Labor Board certifies the union. Here's what rights are taken away from you. Before, you were the employee and you had a direct contract with the employer. You would go to the employer and say, I want a raise, or I'm not happy with my working conditions. Or so the relationship and the contract was between you, individual, and employer. When the union comes in, that contract is no longer with you directly. It's with the union directly. So you become a group, and the contract is with the group. Okay? So for a workplace and industries covered by federal labor law, we got slightly different in terms of the certification. But effectively, once the union has been officially certified by the Labor Relations Board, you can start the negotiating process. So what you give up when you join the union is a right for that individual bargaining. Normally what happens is the union holds, once a union is approved, given the go-ahead, there's an in-house election. In other words, we define who the president of the union is, the secretary. There's a vote within the employees to say, well, you'll be the president. Okay. So that's an internal vote within the union, what we call the local, which is the entity that's going to be doing the bargaining. And then the bargaining begins. So effectively, the union will go and knock on the door of the employer and say, okay, we're ready to start negotiations towards a first collective agreement. In other words, we're going to write a contract, employment contract for all of us, and we're going to negotiate that contract now. So after unions become certified, they give certification in writing to the employer that they want to start bargaining. All bargaining has to take place in what's called good faith. In other words, everyone has to have the focus of reaching an agreement. So the bargaining culminates normally in a contract. So 95% of all this bargaining takes place in a civilized back and forth negotiation process. And normally it works very well. There is 5% of the case where it doesn't work so well. And in that case, government often gets involved through the Department of Labor. So as I say, during if no contract is bargained, the union has a right to go on strike to pressure the employer. There are certain limitations on the right to strike for certain employees, but as a general rule, that is the hammer that unions have. Now, in the case of a very first negotiation, meaning we just formed a union, we're negotiating now, you get a slightly different set of rights. You have to reach an agreement, or the Labor Relations Board will come in and reach an agreement for you. So they'll come in and impose an agreement on you in the case of the first bargaining session you've just formed. So odds are you're going to get an agreement in that place fairly easily, because nobody wants the government to come in and impose one on you. In next subsequent negotiations, usually agreements run for 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, maybe 4 years. So that's as long as a collective agreement. So the contract gets renegotiated every X number of years, depending on the length that was set up. And once you're into the negotiating process, that can drag on for a long time. But there comes a point where if both sides, either side feels that they're not making any progress, the management has the ability, once certain time periods have passed, to lock out the workers, meaning to shut the facility down and say, until you come to your senses, we're not going to work here anymore. And the employees have a similar thing called a strike. Until you come to your senses, we're not going to go to work anymore. So the strike or the lockout is a big hammer. Not very many places go to that stage. So employers are not allowed to fire employees who are on strike. Not allowed to do it, but they're not prevented from replacing them with replacement workers either. That has created some problems in Canada. So one of the conditions of a settlement is successful strikes is nearly always getting rid of replacement employees. So collective bargaining works very well. And it started, in the states, the various acts, employment legislation, the Wagner Act down in the states, and up in Canada came up in the 30s. This bargaining process goes on. It's a back and forth. Once certified, either party can serve notice. Members of the union must ratify collective agreements for them to be effective. So in other words, everyone has to vote on the collective agreement to make it happen. Either party or government can request what's called mediation to assist in the bargaining process. Let's assume that you're the employer, I'm the employee, I'm the union. We're working back and forth. We can't seem to reach an agreement. What we can do is we can call up the government and say, hey, government, Department of Labor, that is, could you help us? And they bring in either what's called a conciliator or a mediator. Conciliator is a must. It's a government employee who comes in, and before we ever go on strike, we got to have that conciliator, and helps us kind of reach an agreement. It's like that third party helping hand that comes in. A mediator is almost the same thing, but it might not be a member of government. It could be someone else, but effectively a mediator is someone who's designed to help the parties get together and reach an agreement. All agreements must have certain terms. We need to, once we sign a collective agreement, we're bound by that agreement. It's a contract. But what if we got some problems? Well, every agreement has to have a dispute settlement mechanism built into it called a grievance procedure. And that is, if we have a problem during the term of the agreement, we are not going to go on strike. We promise. We won't go on strike. And the employer is promising they're going to lock us out. What's going to happen, though, is we're going to have a process to resolve this disagreement. And that process involves back and forth. And again, I don't need to get in, it's beyond the scope of this course, but the fact of the matter is they're not allowed to go on strike during a collective agreement, during a term of a collective agreement, nor are they allowed to lock you out during, this is where you heard the term illegal strikes. Illegal strikes is when either the workers walk off the job or the employer locks people out while they're under the terms of the contract. And the courts will send you back, and there could be fines. It's, what you're doing is breaking the contract effectively. The bargaining must also take place and talk about, things like you got to be a member of the union or work here, what we call a union shop. The provincial government is set up that way. In order to work for the provincial government, you have to be part of the union. Contract might require this, might not. In some places, there are some places where you don't have to be a member of the union, but you can still work there. And the problem that creates is that the union members go do all the bargaining and do all the hard work, and people who are not in union get the same benefits. So if the union works to negotiate a really good salary increase, usually people that are in union get the same salary increase. That was a big problem. So in Canada, there's something called the RAND formula. The RAND formula says, if you don't want to join the union, maybe you got some religious, there could be an extenuating circumstances, or the contract may allow not everyone needs to be in the union. Regardless, though, you have to pay the union dues. Okay, the RAND formula says if you're going to get the benefits of the union, the fact that you're not in the union really doesn't matter. You're going to get the benefits. You have to pay the dues. Okay, so we're not allowed to go on strike during the terms of the contract, but the contract, once the contract is up, 3 or 4 years, however long, we're going to go through a negotiating process, and we theoretically could go on strike. And the idea of a strike, sometimes called job action, is once we pass several marks and we've done all the things we can do, there's a number of processes that we need to have a negotiating set up. Then if that doesn't work, we need a conciliator to come in. We need a certain amount of time for the conciliator to work and write a report. Once that time has elapsed, we are allowed to go on strike. But the fact of the matter is that once we're on strike, we're under limits too. We can picket, but we're limited to what we can pick up. That's putting up signs that say, don't buy from this person. So there are certain limits on employees and employers with regards to that too. And the union is also forced to represent employees well. They got to do a good job. So effectively, in our Canadian legal environment, then, unions create an interesting setup in terms of the contract between the employer and the employee, because it's with a group as opposed to an individual. That's the key takeaway from that. There's also other pieces of employment legislation that affects the employment-employee relationship. Things like workers' compensation. Workers' compensation is a system of no-fault insurance that was created in Canada and other parts of the world as well, but I'll just worry about Canada for now. It's created in Canada and it's administered provincially because, again, we've got labor mainly being provincial jurisdiction. But effectively, what it is, it's a no-fault insurance that the employer pays. And what the employer will do is pay money into that fund at a certain rate. It's a defined rate depending on the industry. And that will cover you. So if you're hurt on the job, your pay and your benefits and your remediation, if you're killed on the job, pay your family, all of that is covered by this compensation commission. And the compensation commission also does training for health and safety and these sorts of things. But effectively, it's funded entirely by employers. Employers pay the bill. And what do you give up? You give up the right to sue the employer. In order to allow for this system to work, what it does is it shields the employer from being sued. Okay? So that's what you get and what you get. We also have an employment insurance system in Canada, which again covers most of us. If we work, we pay union dues, we pay employment insurance premiums to the Canada Employment Insurance Commission. So if you look at your paycheck, EI comes out of your paycheck. You pay a chunk of it, and your employer pays 1.14 times what you pay. So for every dollar you pay, they pay $1.14. But effectively, that gets put in a pool, and if you're unemployed, you can draw from that pool. That's how employment insurance works. There is also a growing amount of human rights legislation in Canada. Over the last 30 years, human rights legislation has become prominent in terms of our employment system. And so every province, territory, federal, now have a human rights legislation that prohibits discriminatory action by employers against their employees. So it basically says that you cannot create a contract that says something that is deemed illegal. So you can't say we're only going to hire women. Okay? Can't do that because, again, against human rights. Or we can't say that we're going to employ women, but we're only going to pay them 60% of what men get paid. If they're doing an equivalent job, they get paid equivalent pay. So that's the theory behind human rights legislation. Now, practice is somewhat different. But the fact of the matter is that human rights legislation has certainly been constraining on employers. When they hire people, for example, they have to follow the letter of the law with regards to human rights legislation or could get themselves in trouble. Again, beyond the scope of this course in terms of the detail, but you need to be aware that human rights legislation does exist that overrides contracts and manages what and what you can't do in a contract. And part of human rights legislation is employment standards. Okay, what are the minimum standards for wages, notice, overtime? That's covered off in the legislation that we just looked at last week. Standards can't be waived. You can go above them, but you can't go below them. In terms of supervising employees, it is important to establish a good working relationship with employees. So part of the legislation in terms of occupational health and safety, in terms of employment equity, says you got to be fair, you got to be able to educate your employees, you got to be a clear and fair disciplinary process. So all kinds of legislation ensures that within the realm of a contract, an employment contract, these things are secured. This idea of progressive discipline, for example, you can't fire someone right away. You have the 3 strikes you're out type thing. In terms of breaking the contract, employee theft, often mischief, fraud, shoplifting, these sorts of things come into play in terms of, have you fundamentally breached the employment agreement?